In this conversation, I discuss with Daniel Garner and Andrew Sweeny about OG Rowe's upcoming course at Parallax, focused on unplanning, entitled Look at the Birds of the Air. We talk about how our future has become increasingly unpredictable, how our current education system fails to prepare us for the world, and some alternative approaches to education which center around the art of living. We also contextualize the course inspired by the life and work of philosopher and theologian Ivan Illich, who will be a major focal point throughout the course as a whole. The course starts November 4th. I am also registered and encourage you to sign up. Also, this philosophical conversation series is only the surface of Philosophy Portal. Behind the scenes, at philosophyportal.online, there is a portal into the world of philosophy. So far, we have covered the works of Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, Lacan, and Zupančič. If you are new to philosophy, looking to deepen your knowledge, or need something that will complement your doctoral and professional studies in philosophy, Philosophy Portal is a great place to start. We host conferences, produce anthologies, and are looking to expand our services in 2024. If you want to help Philosophy Portal grow, you can also help by becoming a supporter on Patreon or a paid subscriber on Substack. Links are in the description. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Daniel Garner and Andrew Sweeny. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here with two friends of the channel who have been here many times before. I'm talking with Daniel Garner of OG Rowe's, as well as Andrew Sweeny of Parallax. And we're here today to discuss Daniel Garner as well as Michelle Garner's upcoming course, Look to the Birds of the Air, How We Must Unplan Our Lives. This is a Parallax course, hence why we're also bringing in Andrew Sweeny into the mix. And I suppose let's just start off with a basic pitch to the course. And just a note before going into it, all links will be in the description. I highly encourage checking it out, and might as well throw in that the course will be starting November 4th. All right, so Daniel, why don't you start us off? What is this course about?
Well, Cadell, thank you for the opportunity. It's a treat. And thank you also to Andrew Sweeny for the chance. Michelle and I are very much looking forward to it. So I think it is very difficult in the world today to know exactly what it looks like to move into the future in a way that is well. So we're going to emphasize, like we do in the title, you must unplan your life. And as we talked in our last conversation, the future is very unpredictable at this point due to technological singularities, changing in the economic landscape, and so on and so forth. And as a result, it's going to really, there's going to be much more need to be prepared for the unexpected than to plan away the bad, because increasingly you're not even going to be able to know what's going to occur. And what's fascinating in Ivan Illich is he actually provides a way to look at history and systems that can let you know that it is actually possible for the human to thrive outside of what doesn't seem to be an option. So, for example, it seems like you just must participate in the education system as it is today. And Ivan Illich goes, well, actually, if you look at history, that's not always what human beings did. And there's actually a lot of evidence today that education is a great way not to learn, and it disables you. And he goes on and on. What's very fascinating about the later Ivan Illich that I've really come to appreciate is this emphasis on how culture today disables the human being. It makes us incapable of doing things other than to the degree we say plug up to the system. If you go to school and you get certification, then you're like, oh man, I'm capable now of teaching a class. But actually, you may not have the ability to teach at all. You might just have certification, but precisely because you are given access and power and status by the system, you see yourself as able. And under the surface, what's gradually going on is a disabling of human beings to be more and more incapable of doing things themselves by their own motivations, by their own ideas, by their own understandings. And increasingly, if it's going to be the case that the system is going to remove more and more people from, say, employment, because AI is going to cause unemployment, or more and more people are going to, and you see it today, are dissatisfied with the college education system, then there's really two ways to respond to that. It's hopeless, we're doomed. Or you go, well, wait a minute, maybe we as human beings need to become more capable and able. And Ivan Illich shows you that that is possible, that you can do that. Furthermore, the class is going to be following what are exactly some tools by which to think about living that way? So we'll talk the first week on Illich motivation, which is going to have a lot to do with intrinsic motivation, which is incredibly difficult today because we've been so habituated and trained to operate according to extrinsic motivation, and how that makes us reliant, independent, and thus disabled. We're going to be talking about the importance of being able to engage with a task or with the world in a manner that you're engaging in self-forgetfulness, not self-degradation nor pride or different things. And I think what you need today is a lot of what we'll call phenomenological pragmatism, which is not mere reduction to utility, but an ability to sort of observe and pay attention to ways that you are experiencing life, yourself, and community, to get a sense of if you're on the right track, or if you're falling into disablement, or if you're falling into problematic motivations. We'll talk about how that affects, say, raising children, how that affects when you think about work, what kind of work you do so that you're not just plugged into a disabling system, but you're actually able to do something that makes you more human. We'll talk about the importance of things like courage and the absolute choice, which, as you know, I wrote about in the first Hegel anthology with Philosophy Portal, and other topics of that nature. And I think Ivan Illich, to close, I think Ivan Illich is remarkably unique. I know, Cadell, you've said that like people approach Lacan and they try to fit him in a postmodern box, and he really just doesn't fit there. His thinking is more elaborate, it's more interesting, it's more all of himself. Ivan Illich is exactly the same way, to his detriment almost, because he is thinking so uniquely and so innovatively and so outside of what most people think, that it's hard to categorize him. And so they're like, oh, okay, the guy that did that deschooling book, oh, okay, that's pretty cool. The medical nemesis, that's neat. There is so much more going on in Ivan Illich that I think is very, very needed for us today. And he speaks directly to so many issues that now that people are having their lives wrecked by, and he was seeing what contributed to those things. So I think he's a remarkably important thinker.
Fantastic. Andrew, would you like to add anything to that, or maybe give a perspective on that? I know you've studied Illich and maybe inspired by this course.
Sure. Well, I wanted to do a series of courses, discussions, forums on Ivan Illich because as a young person, maybe in my 20s, I came upon Illich, and it was just the beginning of a sort of revolution in my mind. And I think a lot of people felt that way who have come upon Illich, and yet they don't necessarily have friends, or it's not a big community who are into his stuff. So there's several key things. It's like what I thought school education was. As soon as I read Illich, I realized it's not that at all, right? It's something else. And it's not like he's just a pure revolutionary in some sense, like a naive Marxist revolutionary. He goes really deep into the depths of why the current institutions are so, let's say, dehumanizing on a metaphysical level. So there's the aspect of school, and then there's the aspect of medicine, and then there's the aspect of gender, and all of these things, which he calls them, I forget the term he used, unquestioned certainties or something like that we have about reality. He questions them all, and from a wild kind of perspective, from like he sort of situates himself in the 12th century. He says, let's go back to the 12th century and see how people looked at, for example, the senses, or how people looked at how people looked at religion, or how people looked at institutions or relationships, or and so he goes way back and then brings that to the 20th and 21st century, and talks about the age of systems that we live in now. And so he's a thinker like Marshall McLuhan. When he talks about the age of systems, he's way ahead of his time, in almost every area. Just like when Marshall McLuhan was talking about the fact that we're in a global village, etc. When he was saying that, it wasn't as true as it is now. So more and more of the things that Ivan Illich was speaking up become more and more true. His thinking is durable, so I think he will be more and more relevant in the future. And the reason I asked OG, Daniel and Michelle to come and do this course is because I felt they were living and thinking and being. I it just was an intuition in a way that corresponded with how Ivan Illich thought. So that's why I reached out to them, and they've been doing a lot of work just articulating these themes. It's quite amazing. So again, yeah, I would encourage people to come along and join us, because it's going to be a very interesting ride, I think.
Oh, that's great. I mean, there's a few important themes here that are sticking out to me, as it relates to education as a disabling process, at least education as we currently have it set up. I mean, the first thing that strikes me looking back on my education is, you know, throughout my entire education, like the things that are most important for my life now: building a business, getting straight on taxes, um, organizing a life with a partner, um, even the possibility of raising kids. None of these things are approached in the education system at all. And the people who are teaching in the education system are themselves probably not capable of modeling those activities themselves either. There's many different examples I could give of, I think, the negative consequences of that reality. Perhaps just a weird story, though. I remember talking to my doctoral supervisor, who is, whatever, by all accounts, a well-respected, extremely advanced theorist of evolutionary studies. And I remember him overhearing my concerns with the future of academia and whether or not, for example, I was going to be able to become a professor at a university or something like that. And I remember him saying, well, if I didn't become a professor at a university, I have no idea what I would do with my life. So, and I think, like, the reason why that's so powerful to me is because I feel like the education system sort of trained me in such a way as to leave me with that problem, which is, okay, you're really well educated, but you have no capacity to practically interact with the world. There you go. And I wonder if my story is not singular and unique, but rather extremely symptomatic of a much larger problem, which perhaps most people in my generation are struggling with. And my first point of contact with that would be the mental health crisis in graduate school, which is a well-known phenomenon, but and also this breakdown of the number of graduate students, where the schools are increasing the number of people in undergrad and graduate school, but at the same time there's a decreasing need for professors. And so you have this huge mismatch of supply and demand, and you have these absurd situations where most professors I know are on unstable contracts. They're working not as on a tenure track, but they're working in these part-time roles where they have to hop from one university to another in a form of life which is very antithetical to family life or human life, where they have to move from one city to another based on all sorts of things. So where do we start? I mean, my first question would be, just to bring it back around to, what does an education system, if system's the right word, what does an education network look like which is more inspired by Ivan Illich?
All of that was really good. And I think is so critical. So a few things come to mind. One of the reasons why I think Ivan Illich is extremely important is one, the deep economic analysis that is permeating his work, which I'm afraid many people who do work like him don't even want to touch, let alone do a kind of analysis on the history of thinking and development. And second, what's very important is that Illich provides an alternative to, everyone always talks about Huxley or Orwell, how's the government going to take over? How are you controlled? Ivan Illich will explain it to you far better, because what he shows you is that the system creates a narrative on what it is to use your life well, what it is to make the most of your talents, what it is to have a future, that then when you're in the system, you become disabled to do anything but the system, such as, like, if I didn't get a professorship, I don't know what I would do with my life. And then you become disabled and forced to support the system. So you don't need a big brother. You get a big parent. You get something that plugs you in. And here's also the key. Anyone who does not participate in that system is seen as a deviant. So for example, if you were to say, do philosophy in a blue-collar job, you're seen like a crazy person. And it's not just the college system that tells you that. It's your neighbors, it's your friends. And this is the key. Control, in the way that I think Illich is describing, is a matter of the discourse, not simply force or power. And the entire populace themselves begin talking about making the most of your talents or having a future in a way that sets you up to be dependent on the system that couldn't care less about you, and then actually disables you. And you go along, and then one day you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have a future as a professor, but the only thing I can do is a professor. So then you're jumping around from university to university, basically doing like wage labor, like slave labor, as a freaking associate or whatever. But what else can you do? And you see, in some respects, the narratives, and I'd have to go into detail on this, the narratives of Huxley and Orwell actually function to distract us from the true system of control in operation. Because if we don't see a big brother that's putting a gun to our head, or if we don't see Soma that's controlling us, then we don't actually notice the structure of control going on that then leaves you disabled. And this occurs in education, this occurs in work. And another major concept that Ivan Illich has is shadow work. And shadow work is all of the work that is done outside the system that is needed for the system to be possible. So, for example, millions of people are willing to sit in traffic for 2 hours a day just to get to a job. They're not paid to sit in traffic. And yet, if they didn't do that work, you couldn't have the career structure like you have it today, right? If you didn't have everyone on Facebook creating data, there would be no Facebook, but you're not paid for it, right? So, and also what shadow work does is it makes the work that is done in the shadows become a shadow of its former self, for example. So like right now, people don't really live in homes, they live in houses, which is a place you sleep before work. You're just kind of there. It's more like an apartment you stay in before you go to your job the next day. And so then what ends up happening is homes, and a big shadow work he touches on is housework. And he talks about how the female, and he talks about this in his book on gender, basically is put in a position of slave labor to maintain an environment so that somebody can go to their career or participate in the system. And then the home becomes a shadow of its former self as a house. And as such, it's hard to raise a family. It's hard to, say, create friendships or create communities, because everything becomes a shadow of its former self. Likewise, philosophy, once it only is validated within the system, the only philosophy that's allowed is what is done in academia. And if you say, well, that way of doing philosophy is quite bad, and you try to do philosophy outside academia, you're, one, called a deviant. And two, what it ends up doing is making you kind of engage in a philosophy that's a shadow of its former self, because it's not allowed to participate in anything that receives cultural capital, that receives communal acknowledgement, and it's kind of fragmented and pulled apart. Now, there has to be a kind of diligence and belief that this is worth doing, but it becomes very, very difficult to do, because the very kind of excommunication of that form of intellectual life is put in the shadows, and then it has to maintain itself, it has to somehow sustain itself, it has to somehow keep itself going without any acknowledgement. and that can gradually cause it to fade and fade away. And so there's all these kind of operations that are going on that are tied to an economic analysis, a sociological analysis, and critically, Ivan Illich wants to locate control in the discourse that people have, the very way they talk about making the most of their potential or doing something with your life. All of these things put people in a position where they have to plug up to the system, because if they don't, you're ruining your life, and then you don't get paid, because if people are like, and then the last thing I'll say, if you don't plug up into the system and you're saying, well, I can't sustain myself, oh, but it's your fault. This is the thing. Personal responsibility then is weaponized, because if you're trying to fight for something outside of the system and it's really difficult, it's like, well, you're the irrational one trying to do something outside the system. And so that also, and that's not just the system telling you that, that's your neighbors telling you that. That's the community telling you that. Everyone then participates in a discourse that contributes to a reduction of everything into shadows of its former self. But then, of course, how do you develop the character or the discernment or the motivation to stand against all of that? And then to be, I always think the phrase wise as serpents that Jesus says is so interesting, because what does it mean to be like wise as a serpent? You have to have a sort of wisdom, also a sort of understanding of how to carry oneself and operate oneself in this sort of structure. But Illich is definitely speaking to a dynamic I think we see alive today. And it's like, everyone's like, why are people, like you mentioned, graduate school? Why are so many people jumping in graduate school when they know there's no professorships and AI is going to change the game and you have these financial realities? Because what else are they supposed to do? Everyone tells them the only future you have is in the system, the only skills they have in the system. And so when everyone's disabled, everyone becomes kind of irrational, because what else can they do, right? And so it all leads to this giant, and then of course, to speak to Lacan, if you try to say all this, you're bringing the truth, you're putting the truth in speech, and the discourse or the collective like clamps down on you as, oh, you're only saying that because you failed in the system. You're only saying that because you're bitter. You're actually envious. So anyone who tries to speak truth to all this is then shut down by the collective. And that happened to Ivan Illich himself, frankly. And why taking his analysis seriously can, I think, give support to speaking that truth, even though everyone's going to want to shut it down so quickly.
Anything you want to add there, Sweeny, to maybe your relationship to academia and what you're doing now? I'd be interested in the relationship between your identity at Science Po, is it?
Yeah, I'm working, it's what you were describing. I'm one of these teachers that's working for several universities and hopping around from.
But then you do parallax.
And then I do parallax, yes, indeed.
So
yeah.
I'd be interested to know that tension, what's going on there.
Well, like Ivan Illich, I guess he was a big model for me, because in a way, I think I'm living how he lived out. I'm milking the system, right? But I'm not a part of it. Like I'm not a full-time member of any, university. So, but I teach for pleasure, and also just, to feed my family. As you were speaking, and I want to also answer your earlier question about how he would see education and a more virtuous form of education, and his critique of schools. He would say that education, I would say, is like, he seems like an apocalyptic thinker, like he's just talking about really, a very dark collapse that we are heading towards. You could call it a meta crisis or a meaning crisis, or you just use the biblical term, apocalypse. But he also, at the end of his book Gender, talks about the art of living can be restored, that he suspects that a new art of living can be restored, and the schools would be decentralized sort of hubs or webs, or even use the word webs, before like he was familiar with cybernetics, but he wasn't familiar with, he probably had no idea about what we're doing right now, but that's what he was talking about, sort of these decentralized learning networks, based on conviviality, based on friendship, based on connection, based on, this deep passion, which is something quite fragile and not necessarily something that you can fully you can never really institutionalize because it's bound together by something almost religious like the Holy Spirit, right? It's not something that can be fully institutionalized. So you can, or at least, I mean, he did found several institutions in his life, but he also dissolved them very quick and moved to something different. And he wasn't interested. He was very nomadic in how he lived and how he viewed this sort of thing, because he wasn't interested in these, sort of absolute. He was interested in sort of dissolving the absolutism of the institutions. I was also thinking about an interesting connection between him and Nietzsche, because, he was very critical of a certain kind of religiosity which he thought was inhabiting the universities and the institutions, and which we saw as a corruption of Christianity, which is very interesting because he comes from within Christian, still considering himself a Christian, but his critique of the corruption of Christianity is very Nietzschean in some ways. So it's really about this kind of heroicism or holding high to the spirit. Yeah, so I think that's enough for the moment.
All right. Again, there's a lot circulating in my mind. So let me see where to start. What I've been thinking about, what I've been doing some research on lately, is the history of the greatest philosophers and their professions. Basically, I'm inquiring into where the greatest philosophers in history made their money, basically. And, it's helping me think through a lot of things. I think we have to problematize the relationship which is typically set up between Platonism and sophistry, as far as I'm concerned, because one, it seems like Plato was, how to say this, born into money. He never had to really work for money. And the sophists he criticizes as traveling teachers. They travel around nomadically and they charge a lot of money to teach. Not saying there is interesting discussion there, but I want to problematize that classical distinction. In any case, in short, there are a lot of philosophers from the ancient world that basically come from money. And then there are another class of philosophers who seem to be living in a type of destitute way. Of course, the most famous example would be Diogenes, who famously hated Plato.
Yeah.
So there's this, at least my quick analysis of philosophers in the ancient world, there seems to be this stark divide. Things get a little more complex throughout pre-modern and modern philosophy, and I'm not going to go into the details of that. But what also stuck out to me since Hegel, or I could even say since Kant, is that most of the great philosophers are basically making their money as university professors. And that seems to me to be a huge problem for our thinking today. When we think about Heidegger, when we think about Husserl, when we think about Wittgenstein, we think about Derrida, we think about Foucault. These are all university professors. They made their money from, quote unquote, the system. They're also very much in a deconstructive mode of philosophy. Is there a paradox there to think through? The question here is how do we think, and of course, I think this course and Daniel Garner and Michelle Garner are a great example of how do we think through the relationship between philosophy and blue-collar work. Does this need to be thought through more deeply? In some sense, our network, Sweeny, I'm thinking back to the IDW days for me. I think about you as a good example of someone who I also think about Thomas Hamilrick as another good example of someone who's a professor or has a professional career in the institutions, but is not intellectually or emotionally sustained by those institutions, and that the real passion is found elsewhere. Like, for example, the best example with Thomas Hamilrick would be he's doing his artificial intelligence work at the universities. It pays well. And then he's really interested in Girard, right? And that stuff is going in another direction, right? So, for example, he was doing work on both artificial intelligence and Girard through Philosophy Portal, right? And other outlets. So there's this huge schism, which is I see this as enormous. It's again these case examples, like the case example I gave of myself, I think are less isolated cases as they are fundamentally symptomatic. In other words, there are an enormous number of extremely well-educated, bright people who are doing work in institutions where they're totally spiritually empty, and that their true spiritual passion is elsewhere. How do we address that schism? To me, that's actually practically where some of my offline work seems to be pointing. And then I have some thoughts also about, a network, what you were saying, Sweeny, about a network based on friendship, passion, and conviviality being extremely fragile and impossible to institutionalize. Here, my experience is, and throughout, this is basically my experience throughout my attempt to continue doing my passion. It seems like it's impossible to make a living in these types of networks unless someone who has a lot of money thinks they should fund you. Basically, we have this situation where you basically become enslaved to people who have a lot of money and think you have an interesting project. And then the only interesting things that get attention are who the rich people want to give money to, basically. And then you're basically, and so at least how I see it, on the one hand, you have the institutions either collapsing or not properly feeding the true spirit of the human. On the other side, you have enslavement or entrapment to people who have an inordinate amount of wealth and don't know what to do with it. And then you become enslaved in that way. Now, the fragility is like what institutions do is provide people with security, and people guard their security in the institutions with all of their unconscious might. And the fragility of people in networks like us is basically everything could fall apart at any moment, right? And so again, a course like this I would see as pointing towards or occupying, these specific problems. I don't have a specific question here, but I've said enough that I think maybe each of you would have something to reflect on here.
Well, first off, I completely agree with the problemization of the split between like Plato and the Sophists. One thinks of Emerson going around with his presentations. Randall Collins will talk about. What's very interesting is you have Spinoza, who's making eyeglasses, right? You have Hume, who's mostly a historian. There are examples where some people receive endowments or inheritances. I think the critical thing is finding the middle zone, if I were to say, between Julian Benda and Ayn Rand. And Julia Benda warns that if humanity is in service of the humanities or education is all about being practical, a career, like you go to college to get a career, and he's writing this in like the 1920s with The Treason of the Intellectual. He says, ultimately, learning will be captured by political and economic means, and it will no longer be an enabling of full humanity. It will be in service of economic interest. And so Julia Benda is warning about that. So he's warning about the need for learning to be impractical, basically. On the flip side, you have Ayn Rand giving us the money speech with Francisco that basically warns that if you make money evil, you're screwed. Like money makes it possible for men to, Francisco says something like the choices between like guns, manipulation, and money. Like if I agree, I say, hey, Cadell, I think what you're doing is valuable. I'm going to give you some money. That's a way for me to acknowledge you, for you to become sustainable that doesn't ultimately require bribery or different things. So money can have a moral function in society. But when everything is reduced to money, then everything is destroyed, right? Likewise, when everything is reduced to practicality, everything is destroyed. So there is some very narrow way that has to be navigated. And really what's also happened today that's been very problematic is the conflation of practical with money. It is only practical or a good use of time if it makes money. Well, at this point, you're screwed. And actually, what's so interesting in Atlas Shrugged is some of the worst villains are the rich people. They're not just the government officials. It's actually the bankers, the CEOs that don't respect money. Like, it's not a simple picture of government versus business people. It's all about people not having the ability to choose values for themselves, which is, of course, she loved Nietzsche, right? The Nietzschean child. But what do you do when literally the discourse today makes it to where people are disabled from picking and living according to values outside of system organization or system influence, right? Well, then everything is fragile. That's outside of it, but that's exactly to the benefit of the system, right? It wants everything outside the system to be fragile. So then when you go out and try something new and you fail, you come back to the system with your head hung low, going, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have even tried, right? For me, if I were to speak personally, Ivan Illich, so when I read Deschooling Education a long time ago, it actually, like the main reason we homeschool is basically to make sure our children are enabled, not disabled, and that they're intrinsically motivated. We want them to approach learning as something that they're intrinsically motivated to do. That's like a big emphasis in our household. Sustainability and intrinsic motivation. So one of the reasons as well, like there's another part in Ayn Rand of Atlas Shrugged that was influential on me, is when basically Galt, he's just working as like a manual laborer on the train line. And they're like, why are you doing this? He's like, yeah, because my mind is my own and they can pay for my body, but not for my mind. And actually, he believes if he gives his mind over, he's going to be supporting the system. And this is the trick to that book. Is if you work really, really hard and you're really gung-hoing, but you're in a poisonous system, your hard work is actually part of the problem. That's why it's all about going on strike and only plugging in your work and labor into something you believe in. Because if you're like doing everything the system says you ought to do, but it's supporting a bad system, then actually it would be better for you to be Francisco sitting on the floor of his house playing marbles, refusing to work, because working at that point becomes something that contributes to the system of disablement. And so there's this issue here. Like for me, what I then wanted to do was blue collar work, because one, I had control over my mind. Two, I wasn't going to be a slave. I think careers are basically this is a giant statement. I don't want to say every career. Careers are a kind of discourse that leads to disablement, that leads to people not having control of their financial well-being, not having control over their work. And what has to be navigated is the ability to, how do you live your life in a way that is financially sustainable, that you yourself is maintaining your own ability and creating environments of intrinsic motivation so that your children and yourself maintain that motivation to do the thing that you value, not what the system says is valuable. But here's the problem. If you don't do what the system says is valuable, then money's going to be an issue. And for us, that's where blue collar became quite appealing, because blue collar, like, they need someone to unfold the chairs. They need someone to unload the trucks. And funny enough, you can actually get paid quite well doing blue collar work as opposed to academic work. But this is the funny thing. A lot of people at least in like academic work or a lot of white collar jobs can kind of in the name of status, in the name of feeling like they're doing something with their life or making the most of themselves and, working hard and doing they end up actually trading financial sustainability in order to have that status, right? And that's something Ivan Illich woke me up to. And Ayn Rand, in all honesty. Now, I'm not saying I agree with everything in Rand, because we can get into some of her some significant issues. But the warning of Atlas Shrugged is the idea that if you're Dagny and you're working really hard and innovative, but you're part of the problem, then it's like a transvaluation of values for the negative. Good values suddenly become vices. So you must make sure that what you're doing is not contributing to the disablement. But then if you're going to contribute, here's the issue. This is the tension that I think that basically everyone on the liminal web should be looking at. If you are going to then contribute to ablement, if you will, that's going to be outside the system. And like you said, Cadell, it's economically fragile. So there is a financial problem here that is very severe, that at this point drifts into just being in control of people who have capital. And that then means it's money interest and falls into the poisonous role of money that Rand and Benda and other people are critiquing. And so we definitely, and then I'll just close. If we have this idea in our head that, pure poetry, pure philosophy has nothing to do with money, it doesn't worry about business, it doesn't worry about jobs, we're not going to think these problems. And if we're not going to think these problems, then we're going to stay in a fragile state on the liminal web. And it's only a matter of time before it breaks or shatters or it becomes ultimately irrelevant, just like the system, quote unquote, would want. Precisely so that it can maintain its dominance. So these are the problems. I'll stop there, but I appreciate what you were saying.
Well, there's a lot there. I was thinking as you were speaking, as my wife's family are plumbers, and they drive an Audi, and we're both, like, my wife's an administrator in a university and I'm a teacher, and so we struggle to pay the bills. It's very interesting, and I feel that in a way my education was very intellectual, and it wasn't very practical at all, except for the years that I lived in monastic situations. So when I lived in a monastery, I learned to cook, I learned to organize my thoughts. I learned to, I learned to train myself. I learned to wake up. There's all these things that are just very physical and ordinary. And I learned a bit of maintenance, and all these kind of things that people in the intelligentsia are almost like. I've known professors who can't even cook something without burning it, and yet they've read enormous amounts of books, and they're completely emotionally immature when it comes to relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So it's so I think we need, what I'm hearing from you, OG, and is that we need this kind of earthly grounding in all of our activities. So we need to, we need an education that is holistic, that works on all levels, that isn't just mental. It's we need to, like Gurdjieff says, we have three brains. It's the body, the mind, and this and the intellect. So we need to work on all three. So the closest thing to that I've seen, and the closest thing that actually solves the money problem as well, is monastic living. So I wonder if we're moving back into something that isn't exactly monastic living, but that will have to be communal in some kind of a way, in order so that we can just have very rich existences, that we're not in this position of being slaves to some sort of a patron, or where we're working like everybody in the monastery cleans a toilet, right? Like if you go to a concert or something, if you go to a normal a university, there's these immigrants that are there cleaning your toilets. It's kind of like it is a very it's a very narrow and stratified kind of system, and I think the shadow work that Illich is talking about is this wage slavery, also the things that women do, and also the things that people do that are creative, that don't have some kind of immediate feedback or some kind of paycheck. That any creative person has to live, with some sort of a risk. There has to be a risk. There has to be an ability to gamble, gamble your what you've got. Make some gambles and take some risks, but if you're in this constant fear of, if you're in this constant fear of not having a paycheck, it can be a terribly, it can destroy you, you know. So I think, and the other thing I wanted to say was that Illich is this kind of in between character. He wasn't fully within the universities, like, ever. He always moved around, and he refused to sort of join the club. And yet he also wasn't. He didn't go off into, you know, the forest somewhere. He maintained a relationship with it. So this is something we have to do. We do have to give to Rome what Rome, you know, we have to be somewhat realistic about what we need to do in this world and not become utopianists. At the same time, we have to find ways to maintain a creative, you know, existence.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I would want to throw out a little bit of a problematization of the monastic life idea, just to see what you both think. Because for my mind, if I'm just thinking about myself, my ability to take creative risks, my ability to live without a paycheck, my ability to deal with instability and live a nomadic life are not a problem to me. I can do that. I have done that. Not a problem. However,
to you, right? Yeah.
Sorry?
No, I mean, you're a unique kind of individual, and I think so is Ivan Illich, and I don't think everybody is like that.
That's true. That's true. I don't think what I've done in the last 7 years is. I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend it to maybe a few people, but what I've done is I've sacrificed everything for my creative drive. But I wouldn't recommend that, and there's a great deal of instability and uncertainty that comes with that. However, where that life reaches its limit to me is if I want to have a relationship partner, if I want to have a family, if I want to build in that direction, that life can't work. It can't work. It reaches its limit. Now, this is where I want to bring in the monastery idea. Does the monastery help with that? Because what I saw, I've visited monasteries. To me, monasteries, now Sweeny, definitely correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I've seen at monasteries, is that those monasteries are usually for people who are either not wanting to have families, choosing not to have families, or are in some cases running away and avoiding having families.
Yeah. So I totally agree. Well, anyway, I'll let you.
Okay. So that's what I've seen. So then let me bring it back to a key problematic that I'm trying to work through actively in my concrete existence. From my perception, the institutions are only containing people who are completely compromising on their creativity for safety. That's what I see. And I'm not saying that as just an external observer. I'm saying that as someone who's been in it, participated in it, knows many people in it, and so forth. For a time, I was able to continue keeping my creativity alive in the institutions, but it was always a tightrope balancing act of being able to do that before it broke and snapped. Then I see emancipatory possibilities online. And for a time, the online space, and of course, I'm still participating a lot in the online space. For a time, I saw the online space as also an emancipatory creative outlet. However, I'm also seeing strong and hard limitations here as well now. And those are numerous and varied, and I haven't done a good enough job of organizing or how to categorize where those limits are. But one concept which I'm increasingly gravitating towards is a concept by Yanis Varoufakis, the political theorist, who's basically calling our situation techno-feudalism. And what he calls techno-feudalism is basically all of the giant internet platforms like Google, like YouTube, like Facebook, where what I want to problematize here is the possibility that what we call the liminal web is not as, the risks here is we're not as emancipatory as we think, potentially.
Yeah.
Because we could be pretending to be free creatives within a system which is not even capitalist but feudalistic. And this includes self-publishing on Amazon. Amazon is a part of this techno-feudal vision in Varoufakis's idea. So my point being is we're in a very, to my mind, difficult space of thinking, not only intellectually, but deeply emotionally. The institutions, on the one hand, provide security to those who will compromise all of their creativity. The online spaces are increasingly feudalistic insofar as that they are totally above and beyond any meaningful democratic processes or regulatory processes on the level of the nation state. And they basically become little feudal empires where, you know, the people who are running these platforms not only are in charge of whatever cancel culture, censorship, banning your platforms, whatever that people complain about, but they also are amassing levels of obscene wealth that probably have parallels only among like ancient Egyptian pharaohs or something like that. Like the disparities of wealth are obscene, and our culture deifies these people, right? And give these people a spotlight. So what I'm trying to articulate here is a double bind, because is the solution that everyone lives a life in between these two systems? And if that's the case, how is that to be done? You know, I'm trying to paint a picture of being in between two very iron doors that are closing in on the individual to the point where the freedom is absolutely can't even be seen anymore. Right. So what ideas are coming to you, Daniel?
That was beyond excellent. So there's a few things. First off, a way I would break it down is you have nomadic and isolationist strategies. I also think of the Benedict option. I think about Dugin's fourth political theory. You have the Deleuzian nomadic strategy. These work in one sense, but at the expense of the family. And the Collins are right about this. Simone and Malcolm are correct about this. No one has figured out how to have a first world society or a modern society that does not lead to falling birth rates. This is the problem. If there is no answer to this, well then yes, you have the isolationist or nomadic strategies. And there's also arguments to be made following the Humean idea that everyone needs a period in their life doing something that's more monastic, like as a period. But if you make it a whole way of life, then it sacrifices birth rates. That seems to be the case. And Salcom and the Collins are absolutely correct that modern society, socioeconomics, is going to undergo a financial ruin, the likes of which are hard to put into words due to the demographic crisis. So this is a very, very severe issue. But that leaves you with, how do you have an integrative strategy? Okay, some sort of integrative strategy that is able to work with modern life, maintain high birth rates, and not lead to having high birth rates because you're mentally unhealthy. Because like you were saying with the system, people who are secure and are able to then have a family do so, though, at the expense of either their mental health or their creative drive, right? So the question is the following. How do you not sacrifice your mental health? How do you honor your creative drive? And how do you do that with high birth rates and then not just be serving feudal lords? Okay, I'm going to call that the integrative strategy. All right. No one has an answer to the integrative strategy. That's why we should all be thinking the integrative strategy. Because if all we do is say everyone should be nomadic, that will work. We know that works. Okay, that works. That's fine. Or if you say, well, let's have decentralized, isolated communities, Well, that can work to some degree, but then what are you going to do if you don't have a plumber in your neighborhood and the pipes all go bad, right? One of the reasons you get large integrated supply chains is precisely because nobody knows how to do all of the different tasks necessary for modern life. So the more isolationist you are, the more you are going to have to sacrifice eventually some sort of the conveniences of modern life. And maybe some of that would be good, but some of that might be the internet, unless you know how to build the internet towers and know how to service internet routers if they break and so on and so forth. And I'm afraid a lot of the people who are doing that strategy say, oh, robots and AI will take care of it. I feel like it's like Deus Ex AI at that point. Like anytime you see a fallacy in your model, you just say AI is going to fill the blanks. And then it becomes like a Deus Ex Machina kind of thing. And I'll believe it when I see it. A robot that can plant a garden and do your housework is quite an advanced robot, far more difficult than an algorithm that can stock pick or something like that. Not saying it's impossible, but we do have to be careful if our future is riding upon some Deus Ex AI of some kind. Now, to continue, the notion of techno-feudalism is very good. So here's the issue. We have to understand, also, I'm going to strongly argue in Belonging Again, the address, that the loss of the creative drive will be the end of the economy following Keynes because markets are not self-correcting. So here's the great joke. We've created an economic system that sacrifices creative drive, and I'm going to argue that means it destroys itself because there is a limit to how much demand you can stimulate following Keynes, and eventually it leads to a great stagnation. That's exactly what has occurred following Keynes and Tyler Cohns and all these different people. And eventually, if growth slows down too much, then demand goes down, the economy falls below what's called the demand event horizon, and it cannot recover. So in sacrificing the creative drive, we've also doomed the economy. I have to make that argument. It's going to involve going into Keynes, Stigler, Joseph Stiglitz and Chopin, all these different people. Anyway, on the techno-feudalism, which is very important, Adam Smith argues. So the question is the following: what broke up feudalism? A lot of people say, oh, it was freedom. Freedom created wealth. No, that is not what Adam Smith says. It was not, because you have this notion in kind of conservative thinking that if you give people more freedom, you're going to get more wealth, right? Like give people freedom, capitalism, the markets go on. That's not what Adam Smith thinks. That's not even what Friedrich Hayek argued. He said some of the stupid, Friedrich Hayek has a quote where he says some of the dumbest words ever said was laissez-faire capitalism. There is no such thing, really. And what's very important is what Adam Smith argues is that the breakup of the feudal lords, it was the fact that the feudal lords spent all their money buying trinkets they didn't need or market goods. Then they could no longer have the wealth to sustain the property. They broke up, and then you had liberation that occurred. Here's the key. Because the feudal lords could spend their money on something versus just save it up and then reinvest it in their estate. This is what has to occur. This is why this is everything. Until there is an investment mechanism on the liminal web for the liminal web, not a patron model, but a mechanism of investment where people with money can invest in, say, philosophy, portal, or parallax, then there's not going to be anywhere for money to put their money that assists with what's called digital assets, as Anthony will talk about intrinsic harmony, and he's excellent on this topic on market functions. There is no pricing mechanism or market mechanism for investment on digital assets. Until that occurs, then it's simply going to be a hostage situation where I give you money, therefore you owe me. What I mean by an investment model, there has to be a mechanism by which I go, I have $1,000. I believe Philosophy Portal is going to have a future. I'm going to invest my $1,000 in Philosophy Portal. In 5 years, I now have $1,500. That now I've made $500 off Cadell last. And he also was able to make money because he's grown the business. Investment is what makes the future, and it becomes a non-zero sum game as opposed to a zero sum game. Also, I could have $1,000 in Philosophy Portal. I could have $1,000 in Parallax. I could have 2,000 in OG Rose, and you have a portfolio of investment that makes it possible to have liquidity move. Because when liquidity, here's the problem: money is now concentrated in corporations because there are not mechanisms of investment beyond stock buyback or its own increase of its feudal land hold, if you will. And also then I, as say Daniel L. Garner, cannot say invest in the liminal web other than buying a product. Well, that's all good and well, but what's more sustainable if I could say invest in the liminal web, and maybe I gain $500 here, maybe I lose $200 here, but now we have liquidity moving through the system. And without liquidity moving through the system, you cannot have sustainability unless it's just going to be based on rich patrons, or it's going to be based on selling your soul to some sort of system. So there has to be, because here's the key with an investment structure. We hear the word investment and we think investors, Wall Street, evil. Investment that we are describing is actually decentralized, people who know one another, who aren't part of a system, supporting one another in a sustainable way. This is the difference. Investment does not have to be, I buy equity in Amazon and make a lot of money. Investment can be one another supporting each other in a manner that then becomes collectively a non-zero sum game. Now, the question becomes the mechanism of an increase in the value, and we have to get into that because that's going to get in things like data, attention, all of these different questions. The creation of value is going to lead into a market of it's going to lead into a market of internal coordination, as Anthony would put it. The reason why this is so important, though, is because if the problem is, and then I'll finish, if the problem is techno-feudalism, we have to look back on the history of what led to the downfall of feudalism. And it was mechanisms of investment of the people with money that then moved the money out of just their holding that was used to because that's what all the companies are doing, right? Stock buyback. And in fact, that's what everybody wants them to do because their retirement funds are tied to it. So it becomes a incredibly feudalistic system, a corporate feudalism, a techno-feudalism. The way you break that up is by increasing mechanisms of investment that then break up the power hold, that then lead to a flow of liquidity that increases sustainability. There's a million more things that has to be said about that, but there is a lack of a pricing mechanism for digital assets that can lead to sustainable non-zero sum investment across, say, the liminal web, and then in communities that are doing things alternatively, et cetera, so forth. That, to me, is part of the possibility of an integrative modern strategy that would not lead to falling birth rates. It's all going to be dealing with economics. It's going to be dealing so much with not just money, but mechanisms of allocations that we just simply do not have at this point, that do not exist, that must be invented.
I mean, I can just say, right now, the current model of patrons and selling digital objects or courses, whatever, books, whatever, it's just not going to work. So I think that this is super important. I will say that what I've been studying lately is it's basically a quadrant that articulates the path that most people take to economic freedom, and it involves first being an employee, second being self-employed, third being a business owner, and fourth being an investor. So becoming an investor is the final quadrant in the economic freedom game. And so, to me, I kind of find myself in between the being self-employed to being a business owner sort of place, trying to avoid being an employee. But that movement to being an investor seems to be the big move. And then in regards to the liminal web, I have a lot of desire to, for example, support, buy people's courses or buy their books or whatever to keep things going, but it's totally unsustainable. It's totally unsustainable. That's not gonna, and just the sort of the, let's say, free floating goodwill of a few people is not a business model, and it's not a long-term sustainability model that's going to really allow people to build their life off of these passion projects. So the question that I have is, how do these ideas fit into your course? And when it comes to the lack of a pricing mechanism for digital assets, what would that look like? What are some of the technical, details behind that? And would that fall into the category of preparedness? Is that, or is that another plan? I mean, how does this work in your mind?
Well, those are divine questions, and I think investment as the final step is exactly right, and I agree that it's completely unsustainable. But the system wants shadow, quote unquote, shadow work. It wants, this is all shadow work following Ivan Illich. The system wants it unsustainable, or only occurring to the degree that it leads people to plugging into the system. Because if it's unsustainable, then options of escaping the system, if you will, or your own line of flight, to use that Deleuzian, goes out the window, right? So that's all. This is why, for me, Ivan Illich's analysis is so much more valuable than Huxley or Orwell. Because Huxley and Orwell almost function as kind of, I want to say, propaganda to make you go, oh, you would know if you're being controlled or whatever. And you're like, it doesn't work that way. It's more Kafka-esque. It's more your own kind of self-organization. It comes to absolutely also investment is different than a plan because it makes you prepared, because you have other streams of income that are under your control, right? So if something occurs where a door shuts over here, you have investment opportunity or the ability to invest in something new to where you can keep going. Investment is absolutely on the side of anti-fragility, but you have to move away from thinking of investment purely in terms of, say, ETFs, retirement and things like that. You have to think about investment in terms of risk. I think Nassim Taleb is very good when he describes the difference between the taxi driver, the person who has invested in their own kind of street smarts, and they've also invested in a taxi to where if the 2008 financial crisis occurs, the stock trader is screwed, but the taxi driver can just come up with new routes, come up with different ways to do things. And also they've made their own capital to where they can invest at low prices and also then buy a second cab, because now everything has come down, right? So investment is on the side of preparing. And certainly planning is not inherently bad, but it is when it's at the expense of preparing. And so
I just want to say with the taxi cab driver, except in the situation of techno-feudalism where you have Uber owning the entire system, and in fact, Uber doesn't even need to own a cab.
No, you're 100% correct. And Nassim, the other issue is we have to get into, like, a big part of the conversation for me is the system of certification that absolutely serves the feudal lords. You can get into the college monopoly on credentials that has to be broken up. The idea that you have to get a taxi token, like the taxi industry was destroyed by all the tokens you had to buy, which were like $100,000, where Uber, you could just start and you didn't have to do it. So the taxi industry was bankrupted by the certification systems. The certification system, you cannot... Okay, so there's two things you need for a true, like we were talking the other day about a meritocracy, which is an idea that the people who have ability are the ones who actually do well, right? We don't live in a meritocracy. We say we do, but we do not. We live in a kind of certification-tocracy. I don't know what to call it. Like if you're certified, you get it. Okay, there's two things you need for a true meritocracy that's good, that actually people would actually be happy with, that would be a non-zero-sum game. You have to have transparency where people can easily see everyone to tell who has the merit, and you have to remove certification barriers. Because if I have to spend $100,000 to start my taxi business, you just set a huge barrier. Maybe the best driver in Philadelphia now will not be able to be a taxi driver because they simply can't get $100,000 to get the certification. Same goes with CEFs. Now, of course, they go, but we want to make people, they do the whole, this is what Illich talks about. They do the whole certification thing to make sure that low-quality people aren't driving taxis or low-quality people aren't teaching. The irony is what you fear is what comes unto you. Then what you get is people who are really good at certification not driving taxis. You get people who are really good at playing the college game, not at teaching, right? So you create, it's just like if everything is about doing well on tests, then tests just score people who are good at taking tests, maybe, not necessarily people who know the information. Not necessarily, but the efficiency of your sorting mechanism is greatly, it's much less likely to lead to something that's more meritocratic in a kind of good way versus someone who's just good at playing the game in different things. So what you would have to have is in an investment strategy is an ability of people to see the people who have the ability to invest in those individuals and then make money off of the success of those people. So for example, imagine that you could invest in, I'll just throw a name. Imagine you could invest in Aristotle before he was Aristotle, right? You know, I'm going around, I'm online, I'm checking out Parallax, I'm checking out Philosophy Portal, and I say, wow, this Cadell guy is really something. I think he's got a lot going for him. So much so that I want to invest in him before he is a big name and I've missed the opportunity. So I go, okay, I'm going to invest $200 in Cadell before he is Aristotle per se, right? Or Daniel or Sweeny, it doesn't matter. There's then incentive for people with that investment mechanism to look and to search for quality and to judge quality in the same way that right now people are incentivized in an investment mechanism to find the next GameStop, the next equity market, the next company that's going to do well, right? Everyone's research is currently directed toward companies, which then means what? It feeds the techno-feudalism, right? Like everyone's investment strategy is toward researching companies that they think are going to do well, as opposed to individuals they think is going to do well, that is not stuck in a corporate equity structure, right? So the first thing you do is you create the investment model because you change it to individuals, and it's going to have a lot to do for the technical details. We'll get into the work that Anthony and I talk a lot about, and it's going to involve NFTs, the mechanisms of certification, the ability, not just the stupid pictures. Everyone used the NFTs in a stupid way, but the mechanism of the coordination. Just you get into blockchain, you get into Web 3.0. It's beyond simply talking about a new decentralized currency, but an ability to track influence, the ability to track data creation, the ability to track quality of the creation of content. You have to have a mechanism that can actually sort those things, that then would create value as those things go up for the investors in those departments. So that requires getting into what that mechanism looks like, how NFTs work, the way they were used, I fear was used really basically whenever a new product is created, it starts off with speculative madness before it matures, right? Same with AI. Why did NVIDIA go from like $120 that 2 years in the summer? It went from $120 a share to like freaking $550 because there was the AI craze. It's like the dot-com bubble, right? So likewise, a lot of the Web 3.0 stuff, which I have been convinced are very useful mechanisms for solving this investment problem, went through a speculative frenzy that actually struck and hurt their legitimacy that actually could be used in service of liminal web investments as we are so describing. Now, I can go into that. I would be happy to describe that again. And like Anthony at Intrinsic Research Co. has all the papers and different works. I really, really like that guy. I highly suggest his work. He has a book on it as well. Because what there has to be is a way for people to value things that is on the side of internal value coordination that then would have feedback to the people who invest in that internal coordination. And it's going to be involving those mechanisms. But I'm afraid right now, let me put it this way, a lot of the Web 3.0 conversation is too focused on replacing the fiat currency system. Like everything is about how fiat currency is doomed and blockchain is like a return to the gold standard. The Bitcoin, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of arguments to be had on fiat currency being unsustainable. There's also lots of arguments to be had that to move off the fiat currency, you'd have to destroy the global financial system. Now, maybe you say that's what we need. Okay. But the main thing I want to say is that technology could actually be used for investment strategies to deal with the problems that we are talking about. But people, I'm afraid, are not thinking that because they're too focused on the problem of the central banks. That's my opinion. A lot would have to be said on that. But this is the only way to start moving toward an investment model that creates some possibility of sustainability.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, I have to step out in a moment, but
yeah, go for it, Sweeny.
I'd just like to comment on what I've heard that I like, and that is the notion of investment as opposed to patronage. It seems like a liberating principle in some kind of a way. And I would say that you can apply that not just economics, but you can apply that on a spiritual level too. It's like what you give, what you invest, and what you love, you get some return for. So the kind of communities that I see working, right? And I agree with Cadell that just going to live in a monastery is sort of an antiquated way of dealing with that. And I also agree that, but on the other hand, then just having being isolated in a nuclear family, eating potato salad with your relatives, you sometimes want to, stick a gun to your head. You've lost your soul, right? So if we have those two options, they're unsustainable. There's a middle option, which I've seen in certain communities, like in the GAR in the United States with Tractum, where some people are working in businesses like in Detroit. Other people are doing wild artistic things. Other people uh, are married and have kids. Other people are in different kinds of relationships with each other. Many people choose not to be in a marriage, and some people, but they're not monks. So there's an extreme variety of of possibilities of how you can be in that kind of a community. So that's like an ideal community for me, which has all of that variety. The most extreme variety of types of ways of living, because we are also idiosyncratic and different. That the problem is always, and the problem that Ivan Illich is talking about is when we try to herd some, we have a monoculture, or we have we have just employment, we have work, we have all these things where I've never been able to do one thing. I've never been able to just live and just do one task in a repetitive manner. I've always have to do many things at once, where you can't really define what I'm doing. I guess I'm just being human, right? As best I can. And the thing about Ivan Illich also is he doesn't necessarily think there's a solution to all this. Like the feudal empire is going to crash. It's going to reach some extremity, and it's just not going to work. And then the whole thing is going to fall apart. And then his book is called Rivers North of the Future. Then there's, at the moment, what we are is we create these convivial atmospheres which do this, and then because we can solve the problem right now, because it's almost like I feel an unsolvable problem. Like it's almost not worth looking at the problem. It's just worth looking at how to create that community in as real as way as possible.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say, yeah, the investment over the patronage model to me is certainly the place my mind's operating. It's still a little bit unclear to me how the mechanisms work. I was always very skeptical of the speculative bubble circulating around the behavior I saw around NFTs and sort of the utopian narratives that were circulating just a year or two ago, and now of course sort of died down completely. In terms of the discourse of investment in individuals versus the practical steps to the actuality, I'm still not sure how it works or how it could work. But again, it's, I think, where to me we need our mental energy directed. But I feel like we should get back a little bit, especially since we've got Sweeny only for the next 10 minutes, back to the heart of the course, which of course is Ivan Illich, and really the discourse around planning, unplanning, and preparation. So maybe, because you have to leave soon, Sweeny, maybe starting with you. How do you relate to the basic thesis of this course, and what are you hoping to get out of this course, as I assume you'll be also taking it?
Well, I think it's just swimming in the richness of Daniel and Michelle's thinking, for one thing, and also their example, or as human beings. I always feel like there's a friendly kind of, sort of, not a cheap kind of optimism, but a genuine sort of constructive thing going on there. And so hopefully I can absorb some of that. And the notion of, let's say, unplanning, and the notion of the fact that when we really get down to it, anything can happen at any moment, and preparation for me, I would say that it's always spiritual preparation, and then that to me is how we become this let's say, person that is able to survive the apocalypse. Or in your article, Cadell, you were talking about how birds are the original, they're still the dinosaurs, so that was a cool cool thing. Is like, I don't subscribe to the doomer view of reality, and yet I do think we're in an apocalyptic moment, and I think Daniel is right on the kind of cusp of that. And so I like that, and Benita was the same. We also did a course with Benita Roy, and it was a refreshing perspective, rather than just let's say that the analysis of catastrophe, which we're being fed, constantly, or the analysis of utopia. Either one, right? Either the analysis of catastrophe and the analysis of utopia. Neither of them are fulfilling. Neither of them are deep enough. Neither of them are real enough. And so we need something more deep and more real and more thought through in terms of how one lives one's life. And I think that's what Daniel and Michel can offer and will offer in the course.
Daniel, any thoughts on that?
I appreciated what Mr. Sweeny said, and that was wonderful. And I put in the chat for you gentlemen. I really do like the opening of the series that Anthony does. The intrinsic value of digital assets. The Substack is now called the Aristotle Institute, and basically, if belonging again to section 1, part 1, successfully argues that basically the Great Stagnation. That is just like the question of why first world nations fall into low growth that destroys demand and leads to all of these massive economic problems. I would like to argue that basically if we don't figure out how to price digital assets and to value creative endeavors outside of a system, then the modern economy will fail. So hopefully, if that case can be made, there will be a whole lot of people who are then incentivized to look at this problem and to try to solve the problem. Because one of the problems is we just simply don't have enough collective intelligence of people looking at it, right? Because it's so deep and so difficult. And a lot of the people who, well, let's put it this way. Right now, the only people who look at it are the ones in these creative spaces because they're the ones trying to figure out how to sustain themselves. Whereas people outside the liminal web, they probably have like a career at an academia, so they don't really care. So you have economists and people who have the technical know-how or the ability who aren't looking at this problem. And if the case can be made, though, that modern economics is fundamentally incomplete and going to self-devour itself, as hopefully that argument can be made in Belonging Again, the address, well, then this problem must be solved, or modern economics is not sustainable. I just said a lot, but I think this is the problem, basically. Because until this problem is solved, we will only prove able to stimulate demand in modern economics, not create demand. And it seems extremely clear that there are limits to how much demand can be stimulated before it fails. And then you become dependent on financial trickery that leads to increases in values of assets to the points where the younger generations cannot afford them. And then everything kind of collapses in the way that we're seeing. Anyway, the difference between prepare and plan, I taught in China, 14 years ago. And I love the Chinese people. I was in Western China and at Guanyuan, 4 hours outside Chengdu. Some of the nicest people you ever met, just love them to death. And right now, China is basically going through a level of horror that I can't comprehend. The average person the kids can't get jobs. The asset bubble is collapsing. People have lost their retirements. The unemployment is through the roof. China is miserable. All those people had plans. All those people worked really, really hard. All those people, they did everything they were supposed to do. Is it fair? No. Is it wrong? Yeah. Is it real? Yeah. Plans, they're not bad, but they won't. There's no guarantees in this life. And China is a very good example of what can happen. The Chinese people didn't ask for this. They didn't ask for the CCP to do what it did. They didn't ask for those economic decisions. They were trusting. They believed. They followed their 9 to 5. Well, probably freaking 8 to midnight. I mean, these people worked really, really hard. Doesn't matter. The same can
Guys,
happen.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Daniel, but I got to split here. And,
I understand, Mr. Sweeny.
thanks so
Good
much
to
for
see you.
the wonderful conversation, and everybody, please come and join us. For a course which starts last plug, November 4th. Thanks so much for inviting me, Cadell. See you guys soon, I hope.
Love you, Mr. Sweeny. Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Love you all. Cheers.
All the best.
Peace out, Sweeny.
One of the things I guess that for me was very transformative is I just always believed that what happened to them could happen to me. Like, why would I be invincible from all the people that followed their retirement plan and ended up, they were suddenly fired at age 55, so they didn't get, they're screwed now. Like, all of the, you look around and you see stuff happens to people, and yet very often in planning mindset, you don't calculate that happening to you because, oh, the reason that happened to them is because they must not have planned right. No, it's because the system doesn't care about you. And life is very random, and people will screw you over and not care. Now, I'm not saying everyone is evil out there. I'm not saying there aren't good people. But what I'm saying is, like, who do you blame for what has happened in China, right? You could say the CCP, sure, but then the people were willing to do it because they liked the promises of the CCP with the fast growth. They loved the CCP when China had these incredible fast growth. So it's not just the CCP, it's also the people, right? Everyone is in this giant, this is what Illich understands, it's all the zeitgeist. Everyone is in a collective zeitgeist that then one day ends up failing. And what are you going to do now? Well, unfortunately, a lot of people get desperate. They do desperate things, and it's miserable. You must prepare. You must unplan your life because you must take seriously what has happened to other people could happen to you. You are not special in that sense. You are not invincible in that sense, but you can be more flexible. You can be more anti-fragile. You can be more ready for the unexpected. And that to me is where the emphasis on preparation is so big. But here's the issue. This is why the class is needed, in Michelle and I's opinion. Nobody thinks they're not prepared. This is the problem. Nobody thinks they're not discerning. Nobody thinks they're not working something that's worth working at. Nobody thinks they're avoiding the truth. But of course, we create incredibly good mechanisms of avoiding the truth or avoiding our own disablement or our own lack of preparedness. Because in the same way you were saying with Lacan, like the Speech Act, the Speech Act is what brings out the truth. Well, the collapse of the stock market brings out the real. The getting fired from your job brings out the real. And preparation is simply accepting the reality that the real is inevitable. You will, or let's put it this way, you're not special to the degree that you can guarantee you'll never encounter the real. Like, you're not able to do your life in such a way to make sure that the real doesn't occur. Preparation is an act of humility in that sense, of radical humility, where you are trying to create your life to be ready for the unexpected. One of the reasons I chose to not go into a career is so I wasn't dependent on the career track or the boss. And also, I just didn't see the financial future in it. You could get your own, say, freaking Roth IRA from Vanguard, put in the max every single year. Why do you need a 401k that is going to, but the business is going to put double into it? Yeah, assuming they want you and that AI doesn't take it from you, right? Like, so for example, like, if you're dependent, and I'm not saying sending your kids to public school is bad. I'm not saying that. It depends on the area. There are good schools. This is the thing. You have to make your own judgment of that. You can't rely on this. Every school is going to tell you it's a good school. The system is going to tell you that this is good. So do you have the preparation to mentally handle making a decision for your own children that everyone else may think you're crazy to do, right? Maybe in one area that looks like just putting them in the school because it's a good school, but somewhere else you might be like, no, I'm not going to do that because the ability to be your own motivation is one of the strongest things and most important things you can do to be prepared for life. Like, a lot of people, once they get fired from their job, because they're only motivated to do things if other people tell them what to do or guide them, they're not prepared to do an alternative path. They roll over, and then that looks like misery in the family because then the husband is drinking too much maybe, or the family is upset, or then the bills start coming in. So you're not prepared to pivot. You're not prepared to shift direction. And so when the real shows up, you're devastated. You don't know what to do with it. If you're not prepared, for example, you have a college degree and you're unloading trucks. If you're not prepared for every single other person to tell you that you're wasting your life and your potential and you're never going to amount to anything, and if you're not prepared to fight off the thoughts of doubt or prepared to stand to and stick with your own choices because you looked at the numbers and say, well, this is financially sustainable. I'm not having to do a career where I'm working like nonstop and just barely getting by. And I'm also able to sustain a home, have children, and actually do the intellectual work we believe in. Okay, well, I just got to be prepared for everyone rejecting you. All right, can I do that? And can I be prepared also for people will say you're stubborn. Oh, you're stubborn. You're set on your ways. You think you're better than the system. Like one of the main things philosophy and thinking is in the business of is self-defense against those accusations. Because then you might start going, well, maybe I am stubborn. Maybe I do think I'm better than the system. Maybe I should be humble and plug into that system because that's the humble thing to do as opposed to trying to be doing my own way of doing things that to me I know is sustainable, but maybe it would be sustainable if I did the other route. And so then because you weren't prepared for the other person to doubt you and to attack you, you end up losing your life, basically. And that's kind of human self-defense sort of thing. So if you're basically, and then I'll close, if you're not prepared, your life is fragile. Someone's going to come along and take your life, pressure you to do something else. You're not going to be able to make decisions that are best for you and your family. You're going to be dependent on the system to provide for you and your family. And things like the absolute choice, intrinsic motivation, the skills of being able to go into a room and handle engagement with other people, even if you're different, these are all the skills, like we call them phenomenological pragmatism, like these skills that are not merely utilitarian, but skills of carrying yourself in life. Like these are critical. And that's what we're going to, that's what we're going to talk so much about with Ivan Illich.
All right. I mean, what's coming to my mind with the way you're describing preparation and also sort of the way you've articulated the relationship between yourself and the system, because when you're describing some of the situations you were describing there, I could tell it's in relationship to decisions you've made and things you've gone through, and perhaps opinions and social pressures that you've weathered. Is the relationship on that level between a type of individualism and a type of collectivism? So the way like for example, when I read Ayn Rand, well, her philosophy is admittedly individualist. It's rational self-interestedness. And I guess my question is your model of preparedness and is the approach of preparedness in this course, does it have its emphasis on self-responsibility? Does it have its emphasis on some notion of the individual, or am I off here?
No, I think that's a very good question. It's very tricky. Like it's very tricky with Ayn Rand because, for example, Galt is something that Galt makes for other people and gives to them, right? And really what ends up happening is the emphasis on the individual, funny enough, is to make sure that you're not defining your values in a way that supports the system. Because what Dagny does is assume basically that she's doing what's right because he's going to work, she's raising money, she's working really hard. It's like, well, wait. Look at yourself. Are you actually just being taken advantage of by the system and you're actually a slave and you don't know about it? So there's a form of individualism that is the making sure that when you give your life to something, you're not actually being tricked to support something bad. But then there's a form of individualism that is the I don't care about other people, right? And unfortunately, I think those things get conflated together. What you have to have, I think, is that blend between your ability to be a self and a person in community. Because individualism could just be like isolationist, right? Where you're not caring about other people. For me, the concept of self-reliance that Emerson puts forth, because what does he talk about with self-reliance? It's really like reliant on yourself to be your own motivation. He talks about, it's funny, toward the end of that essay, he talks about like, what does it mean to be the image and likeness of God? And he's like, very problematically, people only emphasize like power and language. He's like, well, God is what? A first cause, his own mover, right? Can you be your own mover? One of the reasons why I'm critical, like you mentioned, of the nomadic strategy, the more isolationist, I think about the Benedict option and certainly Dugan, is because what you're doing is you're doing self-reliance at the expense of community. The trick that Ivan Illich wants to explore, which is why I lean toward him, although again, I defend Rand in the sense of her individualism. Most people who defend Rand, like most conservatives, in my opinion, are very foolish. Like it's a very simplistic take. But there is also then the danger. Here's the issue. Ayn Rand did not have a metaphysical basis to stop herself from ending up in problematic sexual relations with her students. You know how Derrida once said, if you want to know the truth of a philosopher, look at their sex life. Ayn Rand is fascinating here. And actually, the doctrine of love has to... the doctrine of love, even if you could see a defense of her individualism as self-reliance, the doctrine of love doesn't deal with the problems of the real, honestly. It doesn't have the basis. It needs psychoanalysis, which she did not do. So you actually lead to all sorts of pathologies because of that. But if we take self-reliance as basically meaning the self-turning wheel, like you can't have a community except that doesn't become pathological, basically, without it being a community of self-turning wheels. Like people who are able to be their own motivation, but also look for inspiration to be their own motivation with others and through others. And also you need other people because you don't know how to do everything. Like you need the guy who can fix your car if you don't know how to fix cars. You need the guy who can help you fix your internet router if it breaks. So there's this but here's the thing for me, this tension between the individual in community, not the individual as the individual or the community as the community, but the individual in community, which makes me think of the doctrine of essence, that makes me think of this ability to be embedded in common life. This is the incredibly difficult space that exists between, dare I say, communism and capitalism. Some people have called it communitarianism, which is what Ivan Illich is emphasizing. It's what I see people in the liminal web pointing toward, is what Jonathan Rauch talks about. It's what you could even say classical conservatives talked about, but they don't exist anymore. This is what we have to figure out to do. So this is how I would put it. There is an emphasis on having the ability to discern your relation with the other in a manner that is a non-parasitical relationship, that is not a prideful or power-dominating relationship, but is open to the other without losing yourself. That's maybe how I would word it. How do you be open to the other without losing yourself? And you could say, well, I'll just close myself off. No, that's giving up. Or you say, well, I just won't have a self. I'll just be the collective. No, that's not going to work. It's the open to the other without losing yourself. Because here's the thing. If you don't have a self in the sense I'm describing, you're actually not going to be able to discern or make the decisions to defend your openness. Like, because you're going to think you're open, but you actually may start doing things to close off without even realizing it. Or you're going to start doing things that you impose upon others without realizing it. Like, you have to be an active agent in your awareness of how you're relating to the other, which means you're going to have to make decisions according to your own ideas of how things should be that other people may doubt or attack you for, right? This is the trick. Like, you have to have enough of a self to be able to defend and keep open yourself, because it is not self-evident how exactly you do that, right? Like, a lot of people will avoid speaking what needs to be said, like Lacan talks about, precisely because they want to keep open the relationship with the other. And if I say the truth, I'll destroy the relationship, right? Well, those are decisions you're doing for the other, but you're actually avoiding the real. But you're the agent that has to judge your relation to the real. See, this is the tricky part here. You have to be an active individual and maintain your openness to the other when it is not self-evident what that looks like. And you're probably going to convince yourself you're doing it when you're not. So you get into everything. Like, a big part of the course is the mechanisms of self-deception. Self-deception only works if you don't think you're self-deceived, right? And then of course, here's the issue. This is really hard. The people who are trying to get good at it are not paid by the system. So it's economically not sustainable at this point to devote your life to figuring out these tensions. And basically, if these tensions aren't figured out, the socioeconomic order at whole is actually quite in jeopardy. Like democracy's doomed, pluralism's doomed, modern capitalism is doomed, and I don't think I'm just saying that. I'm going to make the arguments I believe you can actually make from a technical level, that without this ability, you can't have what James Hunter calls substantive democracy, the ability to talk first principles. Without this creative endeavor, you can't have the creation of demand, only the stimulation of demand. So spaces that figure out how to work and to live according to this individual openness to the other, it's almost like hyphens between all of that. That is what is necessary. And right now, there is not economic sustainability for the spaces doing that, which is dire. Absolutely dire on the macro. So those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Well, I mean, I agree it's dire. I think my opinion at the moment is that we're already there. What I mean is that I think democracy and capitalism are already in some sense done. Not done in the sense of they're not, the semblances of them are not working. Done in the sense that they're more like, I'll always mention the cartoon cat running off the cliff and it doesn't fall until it looks down type of thing. I mean, in terms of democracy and capitalism already, this is sort of the wager of this idea of techno-feudalism is like, of course, in Marx's dialectic, you have primitive communism, you have slavery, you have feudalism, you have capitalism, you have socialism, and you have communism. And the idea, as far as I understand it, is that since capitalism has sort of achieved a type of global hegemony in the digital networked age, there's been a process of a type of divorce between democracy and capitalism, with capitalism going global and there being no regulatory principle to limit it in any meaningful sense. And in that sense, it makes a lot of sense to me that on the global level, it's kind of like the idea that perhaps there's been a step backwards in the dialectic to feudalism on a global level. Now, if what you were talking about with feudalism earlier is true, we could have a repeat of history with people buying things that they don't need to buy or something like that. But it's almost like where I feel if that's true, that certainly any, like, for example, I'll try to bring this in, is Thomas Piketty wrote a book, very super influential book, Capitalism in the 21st Century. And basically what he's arguing in that book is that we need some sort of new socialist principle on the global level to save capitalism from itself. Now, that hasn't happened yet. It got a lot of attention, but there has been no following through with his suggestions that in order to save capitalism from itself, we need some sort of global socialist principle. So in the vacuum of a response to that, the idea is, well, capitalism is already eating itself. The first step back would be feudalism. Well, what's below that? Slavery. Well, you could argue that we're already heading close to that in some dimensions. And global tensions are rising in an incredibly dangerous and ominous way, not just with the Ukraine-Russia thing, but now, of course, with Israel-Palestine. And who knows what other tensions are waiting to explode around the corner. And it seems like what you're suggesting, and what I see in some sense on the ground level in your life, is more something that I would call primitive communism. In the sense, so using the dialectic again, primitive communism in the sense that it's going back to the ground and it's going back to the very local, and it's saying the only space of freedom in our current situation is going very, very local, where we have the possibility to prepare. We can't prepare on the global level, but we can prepare on the hyper local level, and then connect with other people in the digital web that seem to be pointing in a similar direction, but we don't yet have the possibility to go from either a type of primitive communism towards a type of higher order socialism, which would be like a sublation of capital in my understanding. So what do you make of that idea that, like, what I see you're doing and what I see in your course is like a ground, like I want to articulate not either catastrophe or utopia, like Sweeny was saying. What I want to articulate is we're in an apocalyptarian moment where it's like the entire politico-economic dialectic of history is unraveling, which brings us back to a type of where the only space of freedom left is a type of primitive communism. And your course is like a 101 for the self in basic community. And like you were articulating, this involves a type of what I would take to be a dialectic of the individual and the community. Where, again, like you were saying, there's sort of what this dialectic between the self and the community looks like is a type of relationship between degrees of openness and degrees of closeness, where deception could be lurking at any corner, where you're constantly under threat from parasitical relationships, where the possibility to communicate the nature of those parasitical relationships does not exist, where the nature of the pride, the power, and the dominance is being expressed in extremely complex and novel ways, because it's happening in an extraordinarily disembodied way. And so with that sort of as a closing note, I would say your course could be sort of, again, a ground zero of the apocalypse, which allows us to, from that point, think through the higher order mechanisms we would need for a real society, which require a massive divergence and redirection of our intellectual energies.
That was magnificent. So a bunch of things come to mind. First off, I think a description of primitive communism is quite lovely. I definitely think that aligns with Illich. And I think that, you know, he was accused of being a Marxist, but what he said is like, well, the problem is that the system disables and makes a proletariat revolution impossible. And in fact, if you just take control of the system that is techno-feudalism, you just change the feudal lord. So he's like, we have to be careful. We have to think of something kind of alternative. And it brings to mind Simone Weil on Affliction, where she started off kind of a communist and was eventually like, no, people are so afflicted and their minds are so captured by the system that the revolution simply isn't going to occur. And that, you know, that speaks a bit to the Frankfurt School and Marcuse and all those different people. But this idea, and the funny thing is, something like primitive, like what's so interesting is something like primitive communism is in fact what classical conservatism kind of defended, honestly. Like that's what's kind of a joke, is this space outside of market forces for individual decisions and individual life that can then be communal and actually engaged in the broader society. So there's a real sense, I guess, where you could say, I almost want to say, we try to do something where it's almost like a Mennonite who reads Hegel and uses the internet, as opposed to, maybe Mennonite is kind of an Amish person who uses technology. Amish who uses tech in a funny way. Like right now, what you have is people who want to like get back to nature. Like I think about the more isolationist strategies, and then they're like, but don't read philosophy, don't watch Netflix, and it's very censor-based. Another way to put this is, how do we live in a life that maintains the wisdom of some of the people who like to censor stuff? They actually have wisdom in their concerns without using censorship, right? How do you be wise about, say, interacting with other people as opposed to just avoiding them, right? Because right now you have like two sides. People are like, oh, just run into relationships. Relationships are great. And they're like clueless, and they end up getting smacked across the face by the real. Or you got people like, oh my gosh, the internet's great. Let's just use the internet. And then they get sucked into an artificial world. So to kind of frame a paradox, like how do you live like a Mennonite who reads Hegel and uses the internet, right? And is globally engaged in that sense, right? That is not what we thought, because that's where the real comes out and everything is really difficult. Let's just talk about like, going off in the wilderness with people we like, and we'll have our online, like the nomadology kind of stuff, like the nomad. Yeah, look, you can be a nomad, that can work, but it's not going to deal with the birth rates. And it is a kind of avoiding the real, ultimately, at the end of the day. And because and you don't have to think the economic problem also. And that is the major problem. And that's why it can kind of be problematic. For me, also, I'll note, I think the question on like, is capitalism doomed? I think it's basically impossible at this point to not have a very significant economic downturn, either because the housing bubble explodes in China and it proves to be more systemic. You have inflation rates that are not going to be under control without causing great bankruptcies of most of the Russell 2000. So I completely agree that financial disaster is lurking. The question is the following: will we just have a repetition of the same? Capitalism, it's like 2008 should have been the beginning of a negation sublation, but it wasn't. And so you get another chance, and you get another chance. And my concern when I talk about like, saving capitalism, what I mean by that is a negation sublation of it. And to what Dietrich McCloskey basically is like, we should have never called it capitalism. It should have been an emphasis on creationism, basically. Like that sounded like creationism, but the creative act, like her series on how like basically what made the modern world is creative people. Basically liminal web spaces, that's where wealth comes from. It's an incredibly compelling argument. She's like, if you do not do that, then your system becomes focused on capital accumulation. Then it becomes focused on asset reinvestment. And then, of course, in Piketty, asset growth always gets above wealth growth or wage labor. And so then assets always are ahead of wage. Well, that's the great stagnation. The argument I'm making is that's what capitalism does unless it can deal with sustainability of creativity. Because let's put it this way. If you are only able to stimulate demand, and by demand I mean the Keynesian term of demand, then you are going to gradually move in the direction of a system that can only increase asset value, that then leads to wages falling behind assets, and that's the great stagnation. So you get low growth, and not only do you get low growth, the growth that you do have is concentrated in the people with the assets. So this is the argument I'm trying to make, where basically the inability to solve the sustainability problems of things that are not valued outside the system will be the end of the system. But my other concern, though, is the system, once it goes through, I do think at this point there is an inevitable turmoil. Without solving this problem, it's just going to repeat. It's going to be a collective repetition of the same. We're going to just try capitalism again like we did. Well, maybe next time. It's almost like a pathology, right? It's like, this has never worked. Well, next time it will, and we'll just keep repeating until the nuclear apocalypse, or then the true end of the game, or something like that. So to me, and you put it very well, when you don't have a negation sublation at points of history where it's needed, you have a regression. You go back into you start going back into feudalism. It just has different clothing, so you don't identify it as feudalism, right? It's techno-feudalism. So you're like, well, that's not feudalism. No, it is. It just looks different. It's in its form. So what happens is if you don't negate sublate at points where it's needed, you get a regression into the past but in a way that looks different, so it doesn't look like you're going into the past. And so people miss it, and they'll then say it's progress, but actually it's just a regression. And then what will happen is you'll regress until you get your next chance to negate sublate, like 2008 should have been, and whatever, maybe 2023, you know, or 24 probably, because I just don't see how the markets can sustain 5% interest rates without mass bankruptcy in most of the market. Anyway, the bond market's out of control as well. So, I mean, the bond market, if you have a sovereign debt crisis, that might be a little extreme. But if you have a bond market that's unsustainable, the global financial system is not going to do well. Anyway, if you get that and you don't jump on that opportunity in the way we're describing, then you further regress and you further regress. And so for me, one of the reasons why you want to be prepared is precisely the inevitability of at least the next downturn. That could be a long thing. You could argue that for most average Americans, 2008 never ended. Like for a whole lot of Americans, and frankly around the world, it never ended. And so, you know, it's not going to end anytime. Not immediately, so you want to be preparing in that way. You don't want to be dependent on a system, but you also simultaneously be working in these Mennonites who, you know, read Hegel and use the internet. That's preparation for the negation sublation. And that, to me, is where you start taking the goods. Because for me, the trick, you know, I mentioned Ayn Rand. It's like, how do you read? The trick today is reading all of these thinkers in a manner that is able to see what they're getting at. Like what Marx is getting at, his analysis is correct. It's what I try to talk about is he's missing the artifacts, the creators of the means of production in his material dialectic. But the communal emphasis and the regaining of like what David calls time energy, these are all completely necessary in the way that Marx puts it out. But if your way of bringing about the communist shift is by seizing the means of production, well, Ivan Illich tells you that those are systems of disablement, and that disablement is the main problem. And so you're actually not going to shift the entire macro system in the way you think. It has to be on that roots level, kind of working up in the way that we're describing. That's kind of a communitarian strategy. But no, I think how you put it is very good. The big distinction that in people's personal lives, in my opinion, the hardest and most difficult thing to tell the difference between, that basically so much of people's lives ride on in their ability to prepare, is telling the difference between fear and wisdom. That's like the ultra skill. That's like the finest of wines, to be able to taste and tell that difference. When are you giving into fear and when are you acting wise? That's one of the main things we want to talk about, because I think that is such a difficult and complex topic. And if you can't tell that difference, then you're not going to be able to tell when you're, say, not plugging into the system as an act of fear, or when it's an act of wisdom. When your act of, say, homeschooling is an act of fear, or when it's an act of wisdom. And if you can't tell that difference, it's going to be difficult to have confidence in your decisions and to live them out and hold to them. And you'll probably break, and then at that point fall into the pathologies we've described. So that's another really big topic.
Well, I think that, you know, that distinction of fear and wisdom, it again brings us back to hopefully what people will be getting in your course, which is back to sort of this the dialectics of the self, the dialectics of the self in community, and back to thinking the real on the ground of primitive communism, which to me, I always say the real is somehow on the level of sexual difference, and I often say class difference. You know, but basically what that means is you know, sexuality and money, or sexuality and labor. It's getting at the real being there. And so in terms of preparedness, I would say that, you know, that's basically the ground zero of what to prepare for. And so what that means basically is, at least to me, is if you're using your intellect in such a way, in the totality of your life, that you're ignoring sexual difference, avoiding sexual difference, and ignoring the practicalities of labor and money, then it's sort of a way to avoid the real. But maybe just as a closing thought in terms of your course, November 4th, it starts, coming just around the corner. If you could talk to someone who's on the fence about joining, what would you say?
That's wonderful. And again, Cadell, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I 100% agree that much comes down to sex, money. And one of the things I was trying to say, like this, where academics and intellectuals make money dirty and we're not going to thank it, that then helps them avoid the real. And they spend all their time just coming up with like new philosophical systems and ways to interpret reality. That's not what we need philosophy for. That's not what we need it at all. I'm not saying it has no role, but it is a much smaller role than the role of dealing with sexual difference, money, economics. I also completely agree. And then also basically, if the liminal web can't thank sex and money, it's doomed. This will not last. It's doomed. And if it's not doomed, the ones that won't be doomed will be just repeating the college system online. It will not be an actual alternative, and therefore it will simply feed the techno-feudalist order. So thanking money and thanking sex, which is in essence thanking the real, this is life or death, basically. I would certainly, the class is in the business of those topics, of thinking those topics. How do you maintain a household? How do you maintain sexual difference? Like another great example that actually, funny enough, I may have told you this before, basically started thinking for me was one time my grandmother said, and my dad said it as well later, but my grandmother said, isn't it funny? Nobody gets married planning to get a divorce. This blew my mind because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's true. Nobody gets married planning to get a divorce, and yet lots of people do. That means people's plans don't, like literally, if you're going to marry someone, you're like, remember when you dated them, you were willing to do anything, right? Just to like see them for a minute, right? And then you get to the point where you probably hate them more than anyone on planet Earth. How is that possible? To me, it was the revelation that the brain wasn't what I thought it was. It immediately unveiled that the brain was not, like I took a lot of walks in the mountains going, oh my gosh, the brain is in the business of screwing you over. Oh my gosh. And likewise, like it created this very healthy distrust of my own thinking, really. But then how do you not have your distrust of your own thinking just lead you to hopeless nihilism, where you're like, oh, it's all stupid. Who cares at the end of the day? Well, it becomes an art form. Ivan Illich was big on the art of life. And today, without the art of life, you're really screwed because the techno-feudalist order is going to screw you. Careerism is going to screw you. Your ideas of relationships are going to screw you. And no one plans to get screwed. No one plans to get screwed, and yet a lot of people will. So what you need to do is engage in thinking and a thinker that is aware of the mechanisms of how the very way you think and experience the world is in the business, basically, of making you overconfident and self-deceived. And the other reason why at the end of the day that's so important is because what Ivan Illich is emphasizing, and that we try to emphasize in the course, is that the art of living is beautiful, but you can't keep it if you can't defend it. And nobody intends to lose it. So how do you create an art of living? How do you create a life? How do you then take a stand for that life? How do you then defend that life? Not in a go out aggressive way, but you do have to be a fighter, because people are going to come. People are going to come and make you doubt yourself. They're going to come and tell you that you're a fool. You're going to then lose hope. How do you maintain that fight? And how do you be good at making decisions so that you don't make a decision that unintentionally makes you not able to sustain your life because you're bankrupt, or you start an enterprise you can't do, or you don't, or you tie up commitments that then lead to the bank taking your life or something like that, right? So how do you make a life? How do you stand for a life? How do you defend a life? And how do you make a life sustainable? Keeping in mind that nobody intends not to do those things. That would be what the course is about.
Well, I think it's a pretty good pitch to me, and I say I'm already signed up, so I'm very much looking forward to what's in store, learning from you, and I guess as a final note, I'm going to say anyone who's on the fence right now, look, Daniel Garner has been a tremendous source of inspiration for me for many years now. He is not only a fantastic philosopher, but a fantastic man. And on top of that, you get Michelle as well, who's just fantastic. So Daniel, Michelle, look at the birds in the air. You're gonna not only learn how to defend your life, there's also gonna be bird watching. You know, so you win both ways. You win both. You can't lose.
Really
All
can't.
right. So links are in the description. Parallax course, Andrew Sweeny helping out, running it as well. This has been Daniel Garner as well. Andrew Sweeny has left us, and for everyone who's been watching, have a great evening.